HOA security, open up right now or I'll bury you and your kid alive." The scream tore through the night like a blade, just moments before my cabin door shattered inward. Right at 3 a.m. sharp, 3 men stormed in, dressed in counterfeit uniforms and shouting about so-called community property infractions. I had been asleep, minding my own business, in my own home. They thought they were about to teach a lesson to a struggling single dad who dared to question authority. But they didn't realize they were walking into a storm of their own making. They hadn't counted on one key detail: someone in the house was still awake. And it only took a few seconds for the situation to turn on its head. By the time the real police got there, the 3 imposters were out cold, sprawled across the floor like forgotten laundry. Lying beside them was a copy of Advanced Close Combat Self-Defense. You think that's the end of the story? Not even close. That was just the tip of the iceberg. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment. I'm Jasper Ravencraftoft. I'm 41 years old, a specialist in repairing antique clocks, and raising my 17-year-old son, Phoenix, on my own since my wife, Helena, passed away 2 years ago from terminal brain cancer. We live in a wooden cabin tucked into the peaceful heart of Green Valley Eco Village. For years, it was a place where neighbors looked out for one another, not where they measured lawn length with tape measures. But then everything changed. Oilia Blackthorn took over as HOA president and brought with her a warped vision of a zero-carbon paradise, enforcing her so-called environmental policies with the zeal of a drill sergeant on a warpath. What started as sensible eco-rules turned into something far more extreme, something borderline tyrannical. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how this nightmare really began, because that midnight break-in, that was just the dramatic finale to months of growing madness. It all started on a Tuesday morning in early September. I was in my workshop, carefully calibrating the pendulum on a 1920s grandfather clock, when Phoenix came crashing in like a storm, waving a piece of paper that looked way too official. "Dad, you have to see this," he said, his voice edged with that unmistakable tone teenagers use when the adults in charge have done something unbelievably idiotic. The letter was printed on fancy, bureaucratic-looking paper. It read, "Green Valley Environmental Compliance Division," signed in a sweeping signature that looked like Oilia had spent hours perfecting it in front of a mirror. At the top, Environmental Violation Notice Number 01. Apparently, our home was now considered a menace to the environment. The notice claimed our wood-burning fireplace and unsustainable materials were a danger to the community's fragile carbon-neutral dream. I had to read the letter 3 times before the nonsense really sank in. Our cabin, which had stood peacefully for over 40 years, was suddenly being painted as an eco-villain responsible for destroying the planet. According to Oilia's math, our modest wood stove was practically melting glaciers, and our cedar siding installed long before any of this madness was violating newly invented sustainable architecture codes. The letter demanded we immediately replace our heating system with an approved solar alternative, and reconstruct parts of the home to meet new net zero emission standards. Total cost of the so-called urgent changes? About $47,000, which, for context, is more than double what I make in a good year fixing delicate century-old timepieces. Phoenix, who'd been training in Krav Maga for 6 years and was closing in on his black belt, looked like he was ready to demonstrate some moves on our new neighborhood overlord. "Dad, this is completely insane," he said, pacing like a caged animal. "She can't just decide what is evil and demand we rebuild the whole house, right?" I felt the same, but something about this whole ordeal didn't add up. We'd been living in the cabin for years. It had always been exempt from HOA changes thanks to a grandfather clause that came with older homes. And I was fairly certain environmental codes couldn't apply retroactively and not to buildings erected decades before they existed. So, I started digging. What I found made Oilia's so-called environmental crusade look even more absurd. The county records were clear. Our cabin was built in 1983, 16 years before the Green Valley HOA even existed, and when the HOA was formed in 1999, our property was specifically granted a grandfather exemption. That meant we were legally protected from any new architectural or environmental changes that conflicted with the original structure. Oilia either didn't know there's a broken bar or she was banking on me not knowing it. Either way, Her violation notice had the legal weight of a shopping list. But it quickly became clear that legalities weren't her real weapon. She wasn't following rules. She was playing her own twisted game. That night, I sat Phoenix down and explained what I discovered about her. This wasn't just a case of a passionate environmentalist going a little too far. Oilia Blackthorn was a former environmental attorney who lost her young daughter to leukemia 5 years ago. According to archived newsletters I found online, doctors had suggested that environmental pollutants may have played a role. That heartbreak had changed her. What began as a quest for justice had morphed into a crusade, one where pollution lurked behind every tree, in every shadow. Her grief had turned into obsession, and now she wielded that obsession like a sword over our community. The next morning, I saw her methods firsthand. At 7 a.m. sharp, I spotted Oilia in my front yard. She held what looked like a DIY carbon footprint scare-apart calculator, part clipboard, and was busily cataloging every piece of firewood stacked outside. She was measuring the dimensions of my cabin, jotting down numbers with furious energy, as if each board was personally wounding the planet. When she noticed me watching from the window, she flashed a cold smile that could stop lava in its tracks. She raised her clipboard high like she just won a trophy, pages full of diagrams, figures, and environmental doomsday projections. It was like watching someone solve an equation designed to calculate exactly how much harm my family was doing to the planet just by existing. Phoenix stood beside me at the window, taking in the scene. After a brief moment of stunned silence, he offered a brutally honest assessment in that way only teenagers can. "Dad, I think our new HOA president has officially lost it." I couldn't disagree, but I also understood something he didn't yet fully grasp. When irrational people gain power, they become dangerous. As we watched her gather her so-called environmental instruments and head purposefully back to her Prius, I had the sinking feeling this was just the opening move in a much larger campaign. What I didn't realize was that by Saturday morning, she'd return with reinforcements, and they wouldn't be holding clipboards. Saturday hit like a wrecking ball. From my kitchen window, I spotted Oilia standing just beyond our property line. This time, she wasn't alone. 3 men in sharp, dark suits flanked her, and they weren't toting around any environmental gadgets. Instead, they held what looked like laser-based measuring tools, aimed directly at our cabin. Engaging in the kind of hushed, serious conversation that usually spells bad news. Oilia gestured animatedly toward various parts of the house, the roof, the chimney, even our solar panels. The men nodded solemnly, scribbling notes like undertakers preparing for a very expensive burial. Phoenix peered out beside me, narrowing his eyes the way he does when sizing up someone before a sparring session. "Dad, those guys definitely aren't from the environmental department." And he was right. These weren't inspectors. They looked more like professionals who handled problems by making them vanish. By Monday morning, Oilia's intentions were no longer a mystery. Pinned to our front door was a document labeled Emergency Climate Action Resolution 15Z. It had the same polished look as a foreclosure notice, complete with embossed seals and bureaucratic flair. The message was crystal clear. Our cabin had been declared an imminent ecological threat to community safety and health. We were being ordered to voluntarily relocate within exactly 7 days to comply with community carbon regulations. There was no mention of what might happen if we refused, but the threat was heavily implied. My blood pressure spiked just reading it. But what infuriated me even more was learning that Oilia wasn't acting on her own authority. Her younger brother, Damon Blackthorn, just so happened to be the chairman of our municipal planning committee. That gave her direct access to zoning documents, permit records, and the means to fast-track anything she branded as an eco-emergency. That night, Phoenix proved exactly why teenagers make excellent detectives. While eating cereal like it was just another Monday, he casually revealed that he'd been doing some digital digging of his own. Using techniques he picked up from YouTube, he'd managed to slip into the HOA's internal email system. What he uncovered made my skin crawl. Oilia had been corresponding with a private firm called Compliance Security Services. Their emails weren't about inspections or emissions tracking. They discussed things like non-compliant resident management, asset seizure readiness, and rapid response enforcement teams. It sounded less like a homeowners association and more like a script for a dystopian thriller. The deeper I looked into the legal standing of our property, the more obvious it became. Oilia's entire operation was built on legally shaky ground. Our inheritance documents made it clear our cabin had full residential rights with permanent environmental exemptions dating back to the original land deed from 1981. That's nearly 2 decades before Green Valley even had an HOA, let alone one obsessed with zero-carbon nonsense. Even better, Helena had left behind more than memories. Thanks to her passion for green technology, we had installed solar panels and a geothermal heating system before she passed. In truth, our home's carbon footprint was about 60% smaller than the national average. Helena had been a true environmentalist, one who believed in solutions through innovation, not coercion. The cruel irony, the home Oilia was trying to evict us from was likely one of the most eco-conscious properties in the entire community. While I was quietly assembling a legal defense, Oilia was busy waging a war of perception online. She launched a TikTok series called Eco Warrior Diaries, painting herself as a lone crusader battling the evils of climate ignorance. The series had 47 episodes, each one more melodramatic than the last, complete with dramatic background music and perfectly timed tears. She portrayed herself as a brave heroine standing up to carbon criminals like me. Her most popular video, racking up more than 3,000 views, showed her standing outside our cabin. In it, she passionately explained how one family's refusal to comply was endangering children's futures and the fate of the planet itself. The comments were brutal. People were calling me everything from eco-terrorist to planet murderer. The fact that my emissions were likely lower than any of theirs didn't matter. Oilia had mastered the art of emotional storytelling, and the truth didn't stand a chance in the social media arena. Then came Sunday afternoon, another escalation. The doorbell rang. I opened the door to find 3 men clad in forest green uniforms. Emblazoned on their sleeves were patches that read, Environmental Security Division. Their outfits looked official enough to fool most people, but to me, the whole thing reeked of amateur dramatics, like a B-movie militia playing eco-cop. The leader, a broad-shouldered man who introduced himself as Coordinator Stevens, informed me that they were here to conduct a mandatory carbon audit. He added that a full environmental compliance inspection would be scheduled later that week. When I asked to see credentials or legal documentation, he just smiled at us low, smug grin and said, "You'll receive the specifics shortly." As they walked back to their black SUV, I noticed something strange. They weren't carrying any equipment to actually test emissions, but they were all wearing tactical gear far more suited to a SWAT team than an environmental agency. That night, I got a visit I wasn't expecting. Mrs. Chen, my neighbor, appeared on my front porch. Her expression was tight with nerves, her eyes flickering from side to side like someone afraid of being watched. She looked around nervously, like someone about to share something that could get her into trouble. In a hushed tone, Mrs. Chen revealed that 6 months earlier, the Rodriguez family had gone through a nearly identical environmental audit by similarly dressed men claiming to represent official eco-authorities. According to her, the Rodriguez home had been flagged for a long list of alleged violations, hazards that, if taken seriously, would have cost them tens of thousands of dollars to fix. Rather than fight it, they chose to sell their home far below market value and quietly moved out of state. This was a family that had been a beloved part of our neighborhood for over 10 years. Hearing this made my stomach twist. It wasn't just us. Whatever was happening to my family wasn't an isolated case, it was part of something bigger, a pattern, a strategy, a campaign of intimidation designed to drive people out of their homes under the guise of environmental justice. Then came Wednesday. The kind of visitors that make you wish your front door was made of steel-reinforced concrete. 3 men in dark green, military-inspired uniforms appeared on my porch like they owned the place. Their body language screamed dominance, like they were used to getting compliance through fear. The leader, a hulking man with a shaved head and a jawline like granite, introduced himself as Commander Brock Steele of Compliance Security Services. He informed me without a hint of irony that I was required to comply with a mandatory carbon audit and prepare my home for a comprehensive environmental inspection. His 2 associates, Wade Titanfall and Rex Grimstone, whose names sounded like they were dreamed up by a video game designer, looked like they could bench press a compact car. All three wore matching uniforms, each displaying shiny badges labeled Environmental Protection Authority, along with shoulder patches branding them part of the Green Valley Environmental Security Division. But the whole getup felt staged, like a costume party where everyone took themselves a little too seriously. Commander Steele launched into a speech clearly rehearsed about their mission. He claimed they were authorized to address eco-violations that traditional agencies couldn't handle. Their operations, he said, were swift, discreet, and beneficial for all involved, including the non-compliant homeowners. When I asked to see the legal documentation proving they had the right to conduct such an inspection, Steele's smile turned sharp. "Mr. Ravencroft," he said, leaning against the doorframe with a smirk that made my skin crawl, "we don't get tangled in government bureaucracy. We get things done. No red tape, no legal bottlenecks, just results." The subtext couldn't have been clearer. They operated outside the law and took pride in it. What Steele didn't know was that I'd been discreetly recording the entire conversation. My phone, tucked into my shirt pocket, captured everything: his dismissive attitude toward regulation, his vague references to special methods, and the not-so-subtle threats hidden behind corporate jargon. When I asked again about their legal authority, he finally admitted they were private environmental consultants hired under contract by local HOA organizations. That admission was crucial. It meant they weren't backed by any actual government agency. Despite the uniforms, the patches, and the intimidating language, these men were glorified rent-a-cops for eco-extremists. Meanwhile, Phoenix had been quietly documenting the entire encounter from his upstairs window. With his phone's zoom lens, he captured sharp photos of all three men, plus a clear shot of the license plate on their matte black SUV. Later that afternoon, Phoenix ran the plate through an online search tool. The results were telling. The vehicle was registered to Compliance Security Solutions, a company that had only been incorporated 2 months earlier and listed the same business address as Blackthorn Environmental Consulting. The connection to Oilia was undeniable. Even more troubling, Phoenix uncovered a string of online complaints tied to compliance security. Multiple residents in other communities had accused the group of using intimidation, unlawful entry, and aggressive tactics during so-called environmental enforcement missions. That same evening, I took our evidence to the Green Valley Police Department. Detective Maria Santos listened patiently as I played her the audio recording and showed her Phoenix's photos. She took it seriously but warned me the legal threshold for impersonating law enforcement was frustratingly specific. Since Commander Steele had clearly identified himself as a private contractor and never claimed to be with a government agency, the case for impersonation was shaky. The badges, though deceptive, weren't illegal unless they directly imitated official government seals. Still, Detective Santos said she would open an investigation, though it would take more definitive proof of criminal behavior to pursue charges. But the most disturbing piece of the puzzle came later that night. As I was out for a walk, Mrs. Chen approached me again, more shaken than before. She shared what she'd heard from others in the community, stories that hadn't been made public. Sarah Martinez, whose family had left the neighborhood 8 months ago, had privately told Mrs. Chen that the so-called environmental officers showed up at night to conduct an emergency inspection. During that visit, they confiscated her late husband's high-end tool collection, claiming it needed to be tested for environmental contaminants. It was never returned. Another family, the Johnsons, were allegedly subjected to multiple random compliance checks. Uniformed men arrived at odd hours, conducted invasive searches of their property, and took detailed inventories of their possessions, all under the thin excuse of environmental assessment. Mrs. Chen's stories painted a terrifying picture, a coordinated effort to make life unbearable for selected families, pressuring them to sell, leave, and disappear so their homes could be reclaimed under the banner of eco-responsibility. It was becoming painfully clear, for families like ours, leaving wasn't a decision, it was a trap designed to look like the only reasonable option. Later that night, I stood in my workshop, surrounded by the soft ticking of antique clocks, trying to process everything we had uncovered. But the more I thought about it, the less this looked like a petty dispute with a neighborhood board. It felt like we were up against a calculated, well-oiled machinea, one that blended intimidation, manipulation, and official-looking lies. The connection between Oilia's obsessive environmental agenda, her brother's high-ranking position on the city's planning board, and the suspiciously timed creation of eco-compliance security all pointed to something far more organized than neighborhood politics gone rogue. Phoenix found me there nearly an hour later, still staring blankly at my workbench. "Dad," he asked quietly, "what do we do if they stop pretending and actually try to force us out?" I didn't have a good answer, but I had a terrible suspicion that we were about to find out. That Thursday night, I went to bed with a familiar tightness in my chest, the kind you get when you know something bad is coming, but you don't know when it'll strike. Phoenix barely touched his dinner and spent most of the evening watching the backyard through the window, practicing the breathing drills his Krav Maga instructor had taught him to use before a fight. At 2:47 a.m., I woke up to the soft shake of Phoenix's hand on my shoulder and his urgent whisper, "Dada, broken bar, there are 3 people by the back fence. They're cutting through the wire." I slipped out of bed, my heart already racing, and crept to the window. Sure enough, 3 dark figures in tactical gear were systematically dismantling our fence with precision and silence, moving like a trained strike team. This wasn't a visit, this was a breach. At exactly 3 a.m., the front of our cabin erupted into chaos. The front door shattered inward as Commander Steele and his 2 muscle-bound operatives smashed through with brutal efficiency, splintering the frame and sending fragments of my antique doorknob flying across the living room. "Environmental emergency enforcement," Steele bellowed, stomping into our home in full tactical gear, armed with devices that looked more like riot control tools than environmental sensors. "Suspected hazardous materials present. Everyone comply with emergency carbon procedures." Wade Titanfall barked about immediate carbon verification, while Rex Grimstone made a beeline for the kitchen, shouting something about unauthorized environmental substances. For a split second, I thought I might be hallucinating from stress, but the wrecked front door made it all too real. Phoenix was already awake. He stepped into view at the top of the stairs, dressed in his workout gear, his expression deadly calm. Years of discipline and martial arts had trained him for pressure, and now that training was about to be tested, Steele, likely assuming a teenager wouldn't pose a challenge, charged up the stairs, barking, "Stand down, son. This is official environmental enforcement." What Steele didn't know was that Phoenix had 6 years of Krav Maga under his belt and the instincts to match. Phoenix met his attacker with precision, a crushing hammer fist to the solar plexus, followed by a sprawl to counter Steele's attempted tackle. Seconds later, a perfect guillotine choke had the so-called commander out cold on the stairs. Wade Titanfall, realizing their fearless leader had just been dropped by a high schooler, tried to charge from the side of the staircase, but Phoenix anticipated the move, lowered his stance, and delivered a flawless double-leg takedown that slammed Wade to the floor so hard, the windows rattled. Before Wade could recover, Phoenix mounted and delivered rapid, controlled strikes enough to make even a trained fighter reconsider his choices. Wade surrendered faster than anyone would have expected from a man dressed like an action movie villain. Seeing his comrades defeated in under a minute, Rex Grimstone panicked and bolted toward the back door, but Phoenix was already moving. He closed the distance with practiced fluidity, cutting Rex off with a sprawl, then delivered a punishing Superman punch that caught Rex square inches the jaw. Before Rex could recover, Phoenix applied a standing rear naked choke, and seconds later, he crumpled to the ground like the others. The entire fight lasted less than 90 seconds. 3 heavily armed men down, unconscious, on our floor, and Phoenix, breathing hard but unscathed, stood above them. As the adrenaline faded, I pulled my son into a fierce hug, the kind of embrace only a father can give when he realizes just how strong, brave, and capable his child has become. "You okay, son?" I asked, feeling him tremble against my chest. "I was scared they were going to hurt you," Phoenix whispered. Just like what happened to the Rodriguez family, that quiet moment of vulnerability hit harder than any punch. My son wasn't just reacting, he was protecting me, and that's what I knew. This fight wasn't about zoning laws or carbon audits anymore. It was about protecting our family from something twisted and dangerous masquerading as environmental activism. While we waited for the police to arrive, I searched the bodies of our uninvited guests for anything that could explain this madness. In Steele's vest, I found what looked like an official environmental search warrant, complete with an ornate seal from the Green Valley Environmental Court and signed by a Judge Patricia Woodland. One problem: Green Valley doesn't have an environmental court. A quick internet search confirmed my suspicion. Patricia Woodland was a fictional character from a TV legal drama canceled 3 years ago. And it didn't end there. Phoenix, ever the investigator, found Rex Grimstone's phone and began scrolling through its files. What he uncovered was even more disturbing: a broken bar inside one of the tactical gear bags. We found something chilling: detailed blueprints of our cabin, annotated with handwritten notes that pointed out valuables and so-called vulnerability zones. These weren't inspection documents, they were plans for a targeted break-in. Every mark on those pages was about exploiting our routines, not enforcing environmental safety. And then came the most damning discovery. Hidden in Wade Titan Falls' equipment satchel was a carefully drawn map of our property, complete with notes on our daily schedule, Phoenix's school hours, and my shifts at the clock shop. Someone had been watching us, studying us, planning this incursion with the precision of a military op. It wasn't just intimidation, it was reconnaissance. When the real police finally showed up, so did Oilia. She burst onto the scene in a pink Save the Earth pajama set, already screaming accusations. "Why haven't you arrested these violent climate deniers?" she shouted, pointing dramatically at Phoenix and me. "They assaulted my environmental protection agents." Detective Santosa, already familiar with our prior complaints, took one glance at the forged warrant, the surveillance materials, and the trio of unconscious men in paramilitary gear sprawled across our floor. Calmly, she turned to Oilia. "You may want to call an attorney," she said. Over the next 4 hours, Santos and her team meticulously processed the scene. What they uncovered inside the confiscated phones and encrypted gear went far beyond trespassing or assault. It painted a picture of a well-organized extremist network hiding behind the language of environmental justice. The phones revealed a private group chat titled Operation Green Cleanse, with 12 active members. Oilia was not only part of IDA, she was the group admin and its lead strategist. The conversation history spanned over 8 months and detailed what they euphemistically called comprehensive environmental raids. These weren't inspections, they were acts of aggression aimed at driving non-compliant families from their homes. Reading through the logs was like opening a manifesto for eco-extremist vigilantism. There were target lists, surveillance timetables, and tactics specifically designed to maximize fear and disruption during enforcement actions. These raids weren't randomo, they were methodically planned psychological operations. As Santos scrolled, it became clear this wasn't isolated to our family or even our neighborhood. The same tactics had been deployed in nearby communities. Families had faced escalating threats, starting with phony citations, followed by increasingly invasive compliance visits, until they either sank money into unnecessary renovations or fled their homes entirely. And Oilia, she spoke in the chat like a zealot. She called homeowners enemies of the earth and referred to their refusal to submit as crimes against future generations. While police cataloged the digital evidence, I found something else, something that connected this operation directly to City Hall. Buried in Commander Steele's bag was a manila folder full of official Green Valley records, our full property survey, permits dating back to 1983, and even recent utility bills. These weren't public documents. They bore the city's seal and were signed off by Councilman Damon Blackthorpe, Oilia's brother. It hit me like a punch to the gut. Oilia had been using her brother's government access to retrieve private municipal data, our legal vulnerabilities, financial information, even structural layouts of our home. She'd gotten it all through insider channels. It was no longer just harassment, it was corruption. Phoenix, still riding the tail end of his adrenaline surge, pointed out a disturbing detail no one else had noticed. The floor plans found in the gear were far more detailed than anything you'd get from public records. They showed internal room layouts, the exact positions of my antique clocks, and even the drawer where Helena kept her jewelry. Someone had physically entered our home well before that night. This wasn't just surveillance, it was a covert home invasion we hadn't even realized had happened. Everyone in the room fell silent. Our sense of safety had been an illusion. We'd been watching a studied without ever knowing it. The case took an even darker turn when Detective Santos got a call from a colleague in the nearby town of Riverside. 3 weeks earlier, a family there had reported a suspicious carbon audit. 2 men in identical compliance uniforms had been arrested while trying to force their way inside a home. Under questioning, the suspects admitted they were part of a larger network that operated across multiple towns, targeting older homes that could be labeled as environmental risks. Their goal wasn't compliance, it was seizure. Their arrest led police to a warehouse filled with confiscated property, power tools, electronics, heirlooms, all taken under the guise of environmental testing and never returned. It was a stockpile of stolen lives. Just after dawn, with our home still swarming with officers, I got a call that changed everything. The voice on the other end introduced herself as Sarah Martins. The same former neighbor who'd vanished months ago after a run-in with compliance. She'd seen our story going viral online and wanted to help. Sarah explained that her ordeal followed an eerily similar script. It began with bogus environmental notices, followed by a wave of late-night compliance checks. Uniformed men had entered her home, taken her late husband's tools and electronics, and disappeared into the night. No paperwork, no explanations. When Sarah and her family demanded the return of their belongings, they were coldly informed that everything had been contaminated beyond recovery and disposed of under supposed environmental protocols. But none of it had been tested, and no genuine disposal procedures had been followed. Her account gave us the missing link, a proof that Oilia's so-called environmental enforcement campaign was actually a front for an organized criminal operation. The confiscated property hadn't been incinerated or quarantined, it had been quietly funneled through online auction platforms and second-hand dealers. The revenue from these illegal sales had been used to expand compliance security's reach into even more neighborhoods. Oilia hadn't just built a scam, she had engineered a full-fledged criminal enterprise cloaked in eco-friendly branding. The victims were carefully selected, families who lacked the resources to mount a legal defense. All the green rhetoric turned out to be just a slick marketing front for organized theft and real estate fraud. But the biggest revelation came from Phoenix. Using his tech skills, he peeled back the corporate veil on compliance security. What he uncovered was damning. The company was owned by a shell entity called Green Future Holdings. Tracing the ownership through layers of corporations, Phoenix found documentation revealing that Oilia held a 75% ownership stake. The remaining 25% was controlled by none other than her brother, Councilman Damian Blackthorne, through his own investment firm. It all clicked into place. Oilia, as the HOA president, was hand-picking targets for her private security firm. Damian, with his access to official records, supplied confidential data and the municipal support necessary to legitimize their actions. Together, they had formed a vertically integrated criminal operation, one that combined political power, official credentials, and paramilitary-style enforcement to systematically strip families of their property under the guise of environmental stewardship. Then came a phone call that turned our private nightmare into a story of national significance. Attorney Serafina Blackwood reached out to me with an update that shifted the ground beneath our feet. She represented 4 other families who had suffered under the same fraudulent enforcement tactics and was preparing to file a class action lawsuit. In her words, it was the most intricate property fraud scheme disguised as environmental advocacy she had encountered in 15 years of litigation. What made her call even more staggering was the revelation that federal investigators had taken notice. Similar schemes had been popping up across several states, and it appeared our small cabin in Green Valley had become the focal point of something much larger. That same morning, FBI agent Victoria Sterling arrived at our home, identifying herself as the lead agent for Operation Green Web, a nationwide probe into eco-fraud rings operating in a dozen states. She laid it out for us plainly. Oilia's organization wasn't an outlier, it was part of a coordinated network that used fake environmental enforcement as a smokescreen to steal property from vulnerable homeowners, particularly those living in older, non-upgraded homes. What made our case critical to the investigation was the concrete evidence we'd gathered of Phoenix's defense recordings, my conversations with Oilia, the forged documents, and the surveillance notes. These had finally provided the smoking gun the feds needed to link Oilia's local activity to a wider criminal conspiracy. But Agent Sterling wasn't done. What she told us next changed everything. She revealed that Helena, my late wife, had unknowingly stumbled across falsified pollution data during her cancer research 3 years earlier. That discovery had made her a threat to Oilia's consulting firm, which had been doctoring environmental impact reports to support commercial developments while targeting private citizens for supposed violations. It was almost too much to take in. The idea that Helena, with her unwavering dedication to truth and environmental integrity, had inadvertently uncovered a fraud so large that it triggered a federal investigation only to pass away before realizing its full scope was heartbreaking. But her legacy lived on. The notes and research she left behind had flagged inconsistencies in official reports tied to Blackthorn Environmental Consulting. Those documents were what first alerted investigators that something was amiss. Helena hadn't just been a brilliant scientist, she had unknowingly been the spark that ignited a national investigation into eco-crime. As Agent Sterling explained it, Helena's meticulous records had laid the groundwork for everything that followed. Without her data, the web of lies might have gone undiscovered for years. A preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday at the county courthouse, though we were told the case would likely be transferred to federal court due to its multi-state implications. Phoenix was expected to testify as both a victim and a key witness. I would present the evidence documenting our harassment, the fraudulent inspections, and the corruption that had threatened to tear our family apart. But what made the upcoming hearing especially important was that it would give victims, many of whom had been isolated and silenced, the chance to speak. For the first time, there would be a public reckoning. Thursday morning arrived with the weight of national attention. The courthouse was buzzing with reporters from environmental watchdog groups, property rights advocates, and investigative crime desks. The media had already dubbed it the environmental fraud trial of the decade. The hearing room was packed. Victims filled the benches alongside community members who had come to support them. Federal agents mingled with attorneys, quietly collecting more information for their widening case. And then Oilia walked in, flanked by an elite legal team and wearing the same smug look she always wore when she thought she had the upper hand. It seemed she still believed she could spin her way out of these, that her eco-mission would shield her from judgment. She hadn't yet grasped the full extent of what had been exposed. Phoenix's testimony was the emotional core of the entire hearing. Calm, articulate, and unwavering, he recounted the terrifying night when 3 armed men broke into our home, a broken bar. Phoenix explained how everything he did that night was driven by a single motive, protecting his father from men who had been threatening our family for months. When the prosecutor asked him to demonstrate the techniques he'd used, a training dummy was brought into the courtroom. What followed left everyone speechless. My 17-year-old son calmly showed how he had disarmed and disabled 3 fully grown, gear-clad intruders using only the martial arts skills he trained in for years. When he finished, the entire courtroom broke into spontaneous applause. The judge had to strike the gavel twice to restore order. The turning point came during Oilia's cross-examination. The prosecutor confronted her with internal communications from Operation Green Cleansing messages where she gave direct instructions to target families using fabricated environmental code violations, presented with undeniable evidence that she was profiting from the resale of confiscated property while claiming to be safeguarding the planet. Her mask finally slipped. "I lost my daughter to pollution," she screamed, breaking down in tears as long-buried grief burst through her polished exterior. "I was trying to stop this from happening to anyone else's child. These families are killing the earth with their careless living." The courtroom fell into a heavy silence. In that moment, everyone witnessed how a mother's sorrow had twisted into a crusade that left devastation in its wake. But the judge made it clear, personal pain does not excuse criminal acts that had shattered the lives of so many innocent families. Then Agent Sterling announced the full scope of the charge as far more serious than anyone had anticipated. Oilia and her accomplices were being prosecuted under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO. The list included conspiracy to commit home invasion under false pretenses, impersonating government officials, mail fraud, wire fraud, and racketeering. Damian Blackthorn, arrested earlier that day at City Hall, faced additional charges of abuse of public office and illegally sharing confidential government records with a criminal entity. Compliance Security was being dissolved, and its senior operative S. Steele, Wade, and Rixa were facing federal charges of conspiracy, assault, and impersonating federal agents. The judge set high bail amounts, ensuring none of the key figures would be released before trial. Restraining orders were issued, barring them from contacting victims or entering Green Valley again. The most cathartic moment came when Oilia realized her crusade had been fully exposed as fraud. She lost control, screaming as bailiffs restrained her, "I was saving the planet. They're the real criminals, not me." Her final outburst, an attempt to cast herself as a persecuted eco-hero, rang hollow in a courtroom filled with victims of her deception. As she was led away, a deep sense of closure settled over me, the kind that had been building ever since that first absurd environmental citation appeared on our door. 4 months after the federal trial ended with prison sentences for Oilia and her network, Green Valley was no longer a community living in fear of eco-enforcers. It had started to resemble the quiet, welcoming place Helena and I once fell in love with. The residents overwhelmingly voted to dissolve the existing HOA and replace it with the Green Valley Mutual Aid Collective, a community organization centered around cooperation rather than coercion, neighbors supporting each other, not enforcing arbitrary rules. When the newly formed collective asked me to serve as its first coordinator, I was both honored and hesitant. Rebuilding trust in a community that had been deeply betrayed was no small task. But Phoenix, now a local hero after footage of his courtroom demonstration went viral, urged me to take the role. "Someone needs to prove that leadership can be about service, not control," he said. So we began to heal slowly but intentionally. We launched monthly Green Valley Recovery Circles where affected families could share their stories, lean on each other, and work through the aftermath of the trauma they'd endured. We often hosted these gatherings at our cabin, which had quietly become a symbol of resistance and resilience. Sarah Martinez, whose family had been among the earliest victims of Oilia's scam, stepped up as co-coordinator. She brought empathy, wisdom, and fierce dedication to helping families still reeling from the ordeal of environmental terrorism. Phoenix's life took a surprising new direction after his testimony gained national attention. The National Self-Defense Institute offered him a full scholarship to their advanced program, along with a chance to help develop training programs for at-risk groups. But the opportunity that meant the most to him was right at home, teaching twice-weekly self-defense classes at the Green Valley Community Center. Every Tuesday and Thursday, elderly residents like Mrs. Chen learn basic protection techniques from Phoenix moves to escape holds, how to safely fall, how to set boundaries. Watching my son help a 70-year-old woman practice a wrist release while chatting about Helena's garden filled me with quiet pride. These were the moments that mattered, and not just the dramatic takedowns or court victories, but the small, human acts of strength and kindness. The attention our story received led to change far beyond our neighborhood. Environmental advocacy groups reached out about turning our cabin into a model for sustainable living built on trust, not authoritarianism. Our journey was featured in Eco-Democracy Monthly as a case study in how authentic environmental stewardship could thrive through education and cooperation and not intimidation and manipulation. Federal agencies began using our case as a benchmark for tackling similar eco-crime rings. Thanks for watching. If this story made you laugh, cry, or rethink what it means to protect a home, then it did its job. This channel exists to transform homeowner stories into human drama and maybe even hope. Subscribe. Be broken bar before someone tries to fine you for emotional damage.